Hello everybody, I'm just about ready to get started. Before we jump into the next game in our unofficial trilogy slash whatever, let's go ahead and talk about Illusion of Gaia Final Thoughts. I think it's interesting. It's one of those games that I go back to from time to time where I think it's just so different than everything else I've played, especially on the same system. The whole concept of basically exploring the whole world, slowly gathering these mystic statues that they very barely explain by the end of the game, but the whole sense of exploration is pretty strong throughout the game, and it's very interesting to see their take on kind of like an alternate Earth kind of scenario. And I think there's several scenes throughout the game that are extremely memorable, like probably the first time you go on the gold ship, or potentially even the beyond lethal drinking game, or even some of the other quirky moments from some of the one-liners. And while usually it's a good thing to remember it because it's just so either bizarre or unexpected, or I would say atmospheric, there are some things that I think do not hold up as well. And that is some of the difficulty curves in this game. This game has the most weird sense of balancing I've seen in a while. I would have loved if the developers back then had taken some time to let it cook, as it were. There are some very weird and awkward difficulty spikes in particular with trying not to go into very specific details, but there is a certain underwater boss fight, I'll put it that way as loose as possible, that really showcases kind of like how overly hard the game can be. And it requires you to potentially basically just face tank and barely survive with one of your power forms, since you get the ability to basically switch between certain forms pretty early on in the game in order to do combat with evil or have extended reach, as a Dark Knight as example. But yeah, there's certain bosses that are just very weirdly, I don't know, like overly aggressive, heavy projectile spam. And I definitely think that detracts from the game. Not every boss is like that. In fact, some are so brain dead that you could stand at like the bottom of the screen and beat them. So it's just very weird going from a boss like that is that easy, that has like a very obvious safety zone, to a boss that requires either literal rapid dash attacks to abuse iframes, or you have to basically try to zone and predict off-screen shots in order to just not get instantly obliterated by a duo boss. It's a very weird mix of difficulty, I would say, for sure. Throughout the game, you collect things called red jewels, the purpose of which we will not reveal in the final thoughts, but it inevitably leads to a bonus dungeon for those that were curious. But wow, good luck finding those without a guide. Some of them are like fairly obvious, like you re-talk to NPCs, you know, certain treasure chests and dungeons have them. And then there's just some ridiculous ones. It's just like, randomly talk to the corner of a building, or not a building, corner of an alleyway, facing a certain direction, and you will pick it up. There's no object there, there's no indication that you have to pick it up. It's the classic, you just have to know it's there kind of things. And while you might be able to get away with that sometimes in other areas, like, you know, you see a barrel or something and you can't necessarily open it, but it's in there, like that's somewhat fair. There's just other times, this is literally on the wall or something. You just have to know it's that wall. So it just ends up being, without a guide, a mash A rapidly in order to find the red jewels. There are some puzzles throughout the game, and for the most part, they're not too bad. I would say from the standpoint, there is one area in particular, which we'll talk about more in the spoilers, that is probably, as I said in the playthrough itself, the worst dungeon in the game, followed by the worst boss in the game. So that I could see kind of turning people off, and if people never completed the game due to that, I don't blame them, because honestly, I recall the first time I played that, it took me like an hour plus to clear that whole place, and it was miserable. Miserable. I think one thing that doesn't really help the game is you have like a very early on power creep of the main form. So if you play as just the regular protagonist, if you abuse iframes, it just ends up being the best character overall. But from the standpoint of then needing to beat other things like puzzles or kind of navigate as the other forms, it could lead to some awkward moments where the other characters feel like ridiculously underpowered, which I don't think is the intent of the game. I think the other forms were meant to feel really good, and sadly they don't for a while. Like, maybe very initially the new form feels okay, but then like as soon as the main form gets an upgrade, you're like, oh, it's just clearly better in like every regard over the other one. So while I like things where you could get iframes to get some, you know, ability to run through enemies, either to kill them or just run past them, is interesting. I think the minimap system in the game is amazing. I think this is one of the only games I've seen where it actively tracks the enemy locations in a really big map. It doesn't really give away too much about the dungeon layout, but it shows exactly where treasure chests are. It's kind of like starting with the compass in like a Legend of Zelda game, where you have a general idea of where things are, but it's not going to show you the room layouts or the puzzle solutions, etc. So you still have to explore without an idea of how big a dungeon truly will be, or some of the weird jumps you have to do between different floors in order to reach certain spots. So I'll give them credits for that. Unfortunately, as I said before, there's just some quirkiness with the game. There's just weird decisions that make the game overly hard, I would say, for casual players. Even I didn't really like it in a revisit. I would say probably one of the biggest complaints outside of a certain boss and a certain location that I alluded to. There's an ongoing issue where when you collect gems dropped by enemies and you get 100 of them, you get a 1-up. And you might be saying, well, why is that a problem? You have that in games like Mario where you get an extra life. Well, normally that wouldn't be a problem, except for some reason they decided when you get revived, you get put there at half health instead of coming back at full health. And you might not think that's a totally bad idea. And then you couple it with the complete absolute nerf in the English version of the game, where healing items only heal potentially 2 or 3 pips. There's kind of like a small pip and a large pip, so basically a 2-for-1 per icon. So when you start getting to the end of the game and you have like upwards of 15, 16, 18 pips, and you heal like 9, and then your healing items only heal 3, it's really brutal. It's actually sometimes just better to die completely without gems. And in fact, the speedrun does that just to death warp out of there, because honestly, there's also a lot of times where you complete a puzzle, like, and you're done with the dungeon, and you have like the world's longest walk back to the beginning of the dungeon, like ludicrously long to go back to the beginning of the dungeon. So just like weird pairings where you want a mix of being able to have like that safety factor of a revive, but coming back at half health, in particular if it ends up being in a boss fight, is just a totally miserable experience, because there's a few times where it's just like, or in particular in the bonus dungeon, where you can't necessarily heal easily and then also go back and re-challenge the boss. Or even if you do re-challenge the boss, it could be back after a point where you could heal, and you just have to either reset the game and go back to your last save, because if you stored up extra lives, you have to get through potentially 9 other lives in order to just even have an attempt at doing it with full health. Or you go through and you have to kind of struggle with half HP. And I know the first time I played the game, I definitely had to go through at half HP on a couple of bosses, which was not a pleasant experience, and it ended up just being a lot of rote pattern memorization versus kind of more forgiving. And I really think that detracts from the game. I think the weird decisions to revive you at half health, the herbs, And also some of the weird times it seems to get you kind of lost in dungeons are definitely the weakest points of the game itself. In addition, there's also an incredibly limited amount of inventory space, which, you know, is sometimes fine, but the game often forces like dozens, or not dozens is too much. Like sometimes it will literally force like 8 to 9 plot required items into your inventory. So if you've been storing up a lot of side items, in particular healing, you actually have to choose to discard healing in order to hold the plot items. This is pretty apparent in one of the later dungeons in the game where you're like, wow, I have maybe 16 slots and 2 entire rows are potentially held up with plot items, which feels really terrible. So yeah, it becomes a game of kind of inventory management throughout where you are forced to menu fairly often, in particular if you're collecting red jewels with a guide, where you just run out of inventory space constantly. So there's just some weird design quirks with the system itself, where like in a vacuum they might not be terrible, but in combination with the other things that are present in the game, it makes it more kind of tedious and annoying than it should be. I will say the soundtrack is amazing though. I think the soundtrack has withstood the test of time. I think the combat mostly is fine. I think the dungeons are questionable. There's some that are fine, there's some that are just absolutely miserable. They feel a little overly long without a lot of methods of healing. So unless you really know your route and will never get lost, and there are a few levels that are purposely mazes just for clarity, so you could very easily be going in circles for a while. It just ends up feeling kind of like a grueling stamina match when it is just, you know, not as enjoyable as the rest of the game. Not saying it's like necessarily overly hard, but potentially going very long stretches without being able to save in the modern era is not a very pleasant feeling. So I'm trying to think if there's anything else I forgot to mention or forgot to talk about. I guess the characters, the cast itself. The game is very dialogue heavy, and unfortunately, due to another design decision, they decided that it was okay that when transitioning between areas or potentially moving around in rooms you haven't been to before, that cutscenes might randomly trigger, which is, again, not necessarily a bad thing when you hear about it. But then they decided for some like marvelous decision that using the D-pad will skip dialogue. I don't understand that at all. So we unfortunately did skip quite a few text boxes due to that astoundingly terrible decision. So even people that are trying to take it slow and just happen to be holding up into a room potentially will just skip dialogue. It's just, I don't know what they were thinking with the chat, I'll be real with you. So I think that's all I really want to mention in terms of non-spoiler stuff. I do recommend that you play through. It plays kind of like a fever dream, I guess is the best way to describe the story, where it starts off pretty strong, but it gets kind of wonky towards the end. Welcome, Chris. It is indeed kind of special. Where I felt like it was much more cohesive in the first few hours of the game, and then the last hour or two of the game just felt like, oh, and then this just happens, deal with it. I don't know why these things are helping you, just deal with it. Oh, you remember that thing you'd be doing the whole game to do something about? Oh, well, this is what it does. We're gonna tell you the last 10 minutes, and it's only gonna be relevant for like 5 minutes. It's like, oh. And it's kind of weird given how dialogue heavy the game is. Like, we're talking like even for like non-SNES standard, it was very dialogue heavy. So if you don't end up skipping the cutscenes, it can easily be like 40 to 45% of the game. Yeah, unfortunately the narrative got very disjointed. I don't know where in the story I would pinpoint it exactly. Maybe we'll brainstorm it during some of the spoilers. But definitely towards the last half of the game, I will vaguely say, the story got very off track. And things just happened repeatedly, back to back, with seemingly very little cohesion. Oh well. Maybe some of it is a translation error. There were some very questionable scenes in English that I really wonder what it was like in Japanese comparatively. Where the main character just came across as like super callous and weird at some point to certain party members, and it was like, I don't feel like he said that. Like, it didn't flow. That didn't make sense. I don't get why he's ashamed of the other person randomly. Was like, are you kidding me, main character? It's just like a weird phrase, and then they never reference it again. So something tells me it's probably a translation issue. But I think for the most part, it's an interesting experience to go through. I just don't think I would recommend it without a guide if you would like to definitely 100% the game, but also potentially find optional healing items and stuff, because the game is really brutal towards the end, and I feel like there's one boss that was designed to just drain all your herbs, so that way it's like a fresh start, rather than it letting you keep your ability to heal barely any of your health by the end of the game. So, I don't know. Very weird stuff there. But anyway, let's go into the spoiler section about the game itself. So I know Chad is upset. Chad is upset. They killed the pig. I'm sorry, Chad. I guess the pig might have come back in the very ending of the game. Question mark. Due to the whole, the world has now changed and evolved humans, or whatever the heck they were going with in that last 20 minutes. I do think it was kind of funny that we went through the journey and we basically screwed up everybody's life except for like 2 people. we basically ruined their lives, chat. I just want you to know. Like, one person went away okay. We ruined Neil. We ruined Seth. Well, Seth is dead, I get. Well, Seth is like technically alive, but it's not human anymore. So whatever you want to consider that. It's just like all those people died. It's just like, I don't know. We made the painter paint himself into a painting. That just kind of happened. The gamble guy killed himself. We're kind of monsters, chat. We are kind of monsters. But yeah, I will say though, the underwater city of Mew into the duo boss of the vampires with the time mechanic of the bomb. One of my least favorite bosses on SNES. I'm willing to state it. I'm absolutely willing to state it. I hate it. I now understand what to do. That doesn't make me hate it any less. It is one of my least favorite bosses across basically everything in SNES. I'm not going to say of all time. I've played worse bosses before. But man, that boss did not belong at all within the game. At all. I am so happy we glitched and killed the refight of that boss. I'm glad I didn't have to do that boss fight legit the second time through. That was like, whew, I'm not dealing with this BS. Between the one guy that RNG teleports everywhere and then the ridiculous, like, constant projectile spam, I'm like, yeah, no thanks. Yeah, just think too, chat, we were locked into the forum as Shadow. So he had no iframes to get through that other than the dodge button, which forces him to stay in place. So that would have been an absolutely miserable fight against that boss. Like, no way. He didn't even have a projectile, chat. No way were we gonna do that legit. That would have been horrendous. And it's very weird seeing it sandwiched between, like, the Griffin and the Sandworm. Like, some of the easiest bosses of all time. Like, just the raw, ridiculous difficulty jump between that and the duo vampire boss is pretty absurd. Even, like, the Mummy Lord, or whatever you want to call it, wasn't too bad. It was just more punishing if you didn't dodge properly. But it wasn't as offensive as duo vampire. Duo vampire was just pure nonsense. I don't know what they were thinking. That felt more like a final boss than the final boss, I'll be real with you. Anything else worth mentioning or complaining about? I guess the game is somewhat funny on purpose. And it gets pretty dark. As I said before, a lot of character deaths. Yeah, the last couple hours just felt like a fever dream. We just kind of went place to place. We're like, oh, we gotta go there. And I'm like, why do we have to go there? Why are we going here? We didn't establish why we went here. The first couple of areas, it made sense. We were just kind of retreating from South Cape. And, you know, these are the things we found along the way. And then we were told to go to this village. And this village says, hey, we're looking for a mystic statue. And we end up in the gold ship. And then from the gold ship, you know, we're slowly recuperating. We found like the village that the father that lost his memory went to, for example. And it makes sense when we lose those characters, but somewhere after Watermia in particular, it started acting very weird. Like, things just kind of rapidly happened. They weren't saying like, oh, a mystic statue is there, or, you know, there's not really a compelling reason we go there. We just kind of go there. Or like the laborers and big air quotes just kind of get tossed in there every now and then. Just kind of a weird section of the game, to be honest, overall. But anyway, chat, I don't think I have any more final thoughts for Illusion of Gaia, so we'll play a little bit of the next game. And for now, we're going to say goodbye to YouTube. So if you did watch to this point in the video or the VOD, I'd just like to say thank you for watching this final thought about Terranigma. And we'll be continuing Illusion of Gaia and hope to see you there next time.